morning light slipped through the large glass windows of a downtown hotel. The lobby was busy, filled with travelers dragging their suitcases, some rushing to meetings, others trying to catch a cab outside. The air smelled of coffee and polished wood, the kind of mix you only find in places that never sleep. In the middle of that everyday rush, a woman in a gray cleaning uniform moved quietly with her cart, wiping tables, straightening magazines, and collecting used cups people had left behind. She looked tired but peaceful. There was kindness in her eyes, the kind that comes from years of hard work and humility. She had been working at that hotel for nearly 10 years. Every morning she came early, often before the sun came up, to make sure the place looked spotless before the guests arrived. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then she kept her words soft and respectful. Most guests didn't even notice her, but that never bothered her. She was proud of what she did, proud that she could support her family back home. That morning, the air inside the hotel felt heavier than usual. A famous UFC fighter had checked in the night before. He was known for his brutal knockouts inside the cage, but also for his temper outside of it. The hotel staff whispered about how rude he'd been to them. He had shouted at a receptionist the night before, just because his room wasn't cold enough. The manager had already warned the staff to be careful around him. Just stay polite, they said. Don't argue. The woman didn't pay much attention to who was staying there. To her, every guest was the same, a person who deserved respect. She only cared about doing her job well and finishing her shift on time so she could catch the bus home. Around 9 a.m., she went up to the second floor with her cart. Most rooms on that floor were empty since guests were out for meetings or breakfast. She began cleaning quietly, humming softly to herself, unaware that she was about to cross paths with the man everyone was afraid to talk to. The UFC fighter came out of his room, wearing dark sunglasses and a sleeveless shirt that showed his tattoos. His expression was sharp, his walk confident, almost too confident. He was on a phone call, speaking loudly about some upcoming fight. As he walked down the hall, he suddenly stopped near the woman. She had her cart blocking part of the hallway as she vacuumed the carpet. He frowned and muttered under his breath. "Move this thing," he said, waving his hand impatiently. She didn't hear him at first because the vacuum was running. She turned around, smiled politely, and quickly switched it off. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, pulling the cart to the side. But instead of walking past, the man glared at her. "Do you not see people coming?" he snapped. His voice was loud, sharp, and full of irritation. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she replied, "I'm very sorry, sir. I didn't see you." She tried to stay calm, her tone respectful, hoping to end it right there, but he wasn't done. "You people never pay attention," he said harshly. The words hit her like a slap. There was something in his tone, a kind of contempt that went deeper than simple annoyance. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, colder. She took a small step back, clutching the handle of her cart. A young bellboy walking down the corridor froze when he saw what was happening. He looked around, but no one else seemed to be nearby. He wanted to step in, but hesitated. This was a famous fighter, the kind of man who could end your career with a single complaint. So he stood still, unsure of what to do. The fighter kept talking, his voice rising. "You're paid to clean, not to block hallways," he said. The woman nodded quickly, whispering, "Yes, sir." She tried to move away, but the man took another step closer, towering over her. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was something darker, a kind of satisfaction in seeing someone powerless. She didn't respond. Years of working with difficult guests had taught her one thing: silence was safer. But even her silence seemed to make him angrier. He leaned closer, his tone mocking, his words sharp and meant to humiliate. The bellboy finally took a cautious step forward, ready to speak, but before he could, the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened. Out stepped Jean-Claude Van Damme. He had been staying in the same hotel, quietly, under a different name. He was in town for a charity martial arts seminar, something he often did without fanfare. That morning, he had gone for a jog and was now returning to his room. As he turned the corner, he caught the last part of the scene, the fighter standing aggressively in front of the woman, his voice echoing down the hallway. Van Damme didn't rush. He stopped for a second, watching. Years of experience had taught him to read body language, and what he saw was enough. The clenched fists, the raised shoulders, the cruel smirk. It wasn't just anger. It was someone trying to dominate another person for no reason. He walked slowly toward them, his expression calm but serious. The fighter noticed him approaching and rolled his eyes. "Oh, great," he said under his breath. "Another fan." But Van Damme didn't look like a fan. There was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. "Is everything all right here?" Van Damme asked gently, his voice low and controlled. The woman quickly shook her head and said softly, "It's fine, sir." But her eyes told a different story. The fighter scoffed. "Mind your business, old man," he said with a laugh. The bellboy gasped quietly. He knew exactly who was standing in front of him, but the fighter clearly didn't. Van Damme didn't react. He simply looked at the cleaning lady, then back at the man. "She's just doing her job," he said. "No reason to talk to her like that." The fighter frowned, now realizing this wasn't just some random hotel guest. He looked closer, his smirk fading a little. "Wait a second. Van Damme gave a small nod. "Yes," he said simply. "Now maybe you should take a breath before saying something you'll regret." The hallway went completely silent. The bellboy could barely believe what he was witnessing. One of the toughest UFC fighters being calmly confronted by a legend of martial arts. The woman stood still, eyes wide, not sure what to say. The fighter tried to laugh it off, pretending he wasn't intimidated. "I don't need advice from some movie star," he said, though his voice wasn't as confident anymore. Van Damme didn't move, but the calmness in his eyes made the tension even stronger. "You know," Van Damme said softly, "real strength isn't about how loud you can shout or how hard you can hit. It's about control, discipline." His words carried weight, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. The fighter stared at him, then at the woman, and for a brief moment, something shifted in his expression. Confusion, maybe even shame. He muttered something under his breath and walked off toward the elevator, pretending to be unbothered. But everyone in that hallway could feel it. He had been silenced, not by force, but by presence. The woman exhaled deeply, her hands still shaking slightly. Van Damme turned to her with a gentle smile. "You're all right?" he asked. She nodded quickly, whispering, "Thank you." He placed a hand on her shoulder reassuringly. "Don't let people like that make you feel small," he said quietly. The bellboy stepped closer, finally able to breathe again. "That was incredible," he whispered. Van Damme smiled lightly and said, "No, that was just being human." Then he nodded politely and walked away down the hall, his calm steps echoing softly. The woman stood there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. She had been scared, yes, but also strangely moved. Someone had stepped in, not to show off, not to fight, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Down the corridor, the bellboy whispered to her, "Do you know who that was?" She shook her head. "That's Jean-Claude Van Damme," he said with awe. Her eyes widened. She had heard the name before, maybe seen his movies on the old TV at home. But seeing him there, standing up for her, felt unreal. That moment changed something in her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. Someone had seen her, not as a worker, not as someone beneath others, but as a person who deserved respect, and as for the fighter, he didn't know it yet. But that short encounter was about to follow him far beyond that hotel hallway. Cameras, witnesses, and social media were everywhere, and the world was about to find out what really happened that morning. The hotel grew quiet after the morning drama, but whispers still lingered in every hallway. Staff members who hadn't even been there when it happened were already talking about it. By the time the afternoon shift started, everyone knew that the famous UFC fighter had been put in his place by none other than Jean-Claude Van Damme. The story spread fast inside the hotel, even though no one had posted anything online yet. People were still processing what they had seen. Van Damme had returned to his room after the incident, but his mind wasn't at ease. He wasn't someone who enjoyed attention, and he certainly didn't want to embarrass anyone in public. Yet what he had witnessed earlier kept replaying in his mind. The look of fear in the woman's eyes, the silence of the people around her, and the anger that had no reason behind it. He sat by the window, looking down at the busy street below. Cars moved like tiny dots and people hurried along, each lost in their own world. He knew how fame could make a person feel untouchable. He'd seen it happen too many times. Athletes, actors, even regular folks who suddenly thought they were above others. It always led to one thing: destruction of character. Van Damme had spent years learning discipline both in fighting and in life. To him, being strong didn't mean dominating others. It meant controlling yourself. That was the difference between a fighter and a warrior. And the man he'd seen that morning, that UFC fighter, didn't understand that difference at all. Meanwhile, downstairs in the hotel cafe, the cleaning lady sat in a quiet corner on her lunch break. Her hands were still trembling a little from the morning. A cup of tea sat in front of her, untouched. She couldn't stop thinking about how things had unfolded. She felt embarrassed even though she had done nothing wrong. But she also felt thankful that someone had stepped in when she felt small and helpless. A coworker joined her at the table and asked softly, "Are you okay?" She nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine now," she said. But deep down, she knew she wasn't completely fine. What had happened had shaken her, not just because of the man's words, but because of how easily people can treat others without any reason. That same afternoon, the UFC fighter was pacing inside his suite, his jaw tight, his ego still burning from what had happened. He had recognized Van Damme too late, and the realization made him even more irritated. To him, it wasn't about what he'd said, it was about being publicly corrected. In his world, image mattered more than anything. He'd built a reputation as a tough guy, someone no one dared to challenge. And now one small incident in a hotel hallway had left a dent in that image. His manager called, asking how the media training session went earlier. And he snapped back, "Don't bother me." He threw his phone on the bed and stared at himself in the mirror. He didn't see the problem in his behavior. In his mind, it was just another morning, and he had every right to be impatient. But somewhere deep down, the way Van Damme had looked at him, calm, steady, disappointed, had left a mark. It made him feel something he didn't like. Guilt. Later that day, Van Damme decided to go down to the gym in the hotel's basement. It was quiet, just a few guests working out. When he entered, people recognized him instantly but tried not to stare. He greeted them politely, tying a towel around his neck. After a while, he noticed the UFC fighter walk in, earbuds in, pretending not to see him. For a few minutes, they trained separately. The sound of punching bags and soft music filled the air. Then, slowly, Van Damme walked over to the other side of the gym. The fighter noticed and straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You train hard," Van Damme said casually. "You always did." The fighter didn't respond at first. He didn't know what to say. Finally, he muttered, "Yeah, I do." Van Damme nodded. "Good, but remember, power is like fire. You can use it to warm people or to burn them. The choice is yours." His tone wasn't angry, it was almost fatherly. The fighter looked away, pretending to be busy with his gloves. "You don't know what it's like," he said. "Everyone's always watching, judging. One mistake and they destroy you." Van Damme smiled faintly. "I know exactly what that's like," he replied. "But trust me, being watched isn't the problem. Forgetting who you are is." The words hung in the air. For the first time that day, the UFC fighter didn't have a comeback. Something about the way Van Damme said it, calm, honest, hit him harder than any punch could. They stood there for a while, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. Van Damme didn't lecture him further. He simply nodded again and went back to his own training, letting the younger man think in peace. After finishing, Van Damme left the gym and stopped by the front desk. He asked the manager to make sure the cleaning lady received the rest of the day off, paid. The manager nodded, already aware of what had happened. He promised to handle it discreetly. As the evening rolled in, the hotel lights glowed warmly against the city's skyline. Guests gathered in the lounge, laughter echoing softly. But in one corner, the UFC fighter sat alone with a drink in his hand. The day had been long and his thoughts were loud. He remembered the way the cleaning lady had looked at him, frightened, confused, undeserving of the anger he'd thrown at her. He sighed deeply. He didn't like admitting it, but he knew he had crossed a line. He had grown used to being feared, not respected, and it had blinded him. The more he thought about Van Damme's words, the more they began to make sense. Power wasn't about intimidation. It was about control, and he had none. The next morning he woke up early, something he rarely did when he wasn't training. He went downstairs, looking around the lobby until he spotted the cleaning lady pushing her cart again, quietly doing her job as if nothing had happened. He walked toward her, and for a second she froze, unsure if she should move away. But his expression was different now. Softer, He stopped a few steps away and said, "I wanted to say sorry. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that yesterday." The woman blinked, surprised. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Then she nodded slightly and said, "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "I had no right. I was wrong." Her lips curved into a small smile, genuine, forgiving. "It's okay," she said quietly. "Everyone has bad days." But the fighter knew it wasn't just a bad day. It was something deeper, an attitude he had carried for too long. He gave her a polite nod and turned to leave. As he walked toward the elevator, he noticed Van Damme watching from a distance, standing near the entrance. Their eyes met, and Van Damme gave him a small, approving nod. It wasn't a grand moment, no words exchanged, no applause, but it was enough. Later that day, when Van Damme left the hotel to head to his seminar, he stopped by the front desk one last time. He asked if the cleaning lady was around. When she came out, he handed her a small envelope. "For your family," he said simply. She tried to refuse, but he insisted, "Please, consider it a thank you for reminding people that kindness still exists." She took it reluctantly. Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I know," Van Damme said, smiling. "But sometimes doing what we don't have to is what makes us human." He walked out of the hotel into the bright morning light, the city waking up around him. The UFC fighter stood near the lobby window watching him go. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt before: humility. He realized that being strong wasn't about fear or fame. It was about standing for something even when no one was watching. That day marked a quiet change in both their lives. The cleaning lady continued her work, a little more confident, her heart a little lighter. The fighter began to train differently, with patience, focus, and respect. And Van Damme, he went on to his seminar, teaching not just kicks and punches, but the kind of discipline that turns strength into compassion. The incident at the hotel never made big headlines, but those who were there never forgot it. They saw how one small act of courage and calmness could shift something inside even the toughest of men. Sometimes true power doesn't roar. It speaks quietly, through actions that remind the world that being human, truly human, is the strongest thing of all. The next few days passed quietly, but the story from the hotel hallway refused to fade away. What had started as a small incident between a fighter, a cleaning lady, and a movie legend was slowly finding its way into the world. Someone from the hotel had recorded a short video, not of the argument itself, but of the moment when Jean-Claude Van Damme stepped in. The clip showed him standing calmly between the two, speaking firmly but without anger. That short video began to spread online. At first, it was just a few fans sharing it, saying how Van Damme had once again shown what true martial arts spirit looked like. But soon, major sports pages picked it up. Van Damme steps into calm heated moment involving UFC fighter. One headline read. The video didn't show the fighter's name, but people started guessing. The internet was full of detectives, and it didn't take long before they figured it out. By the end of the week, the fighter's name was trending. Some fans defended him, saying everyone makes mistakes, but most people were disappointed. They expected better from someone who represented the sport. The UFC itself hadn't made a statement yet, but reporters were already asking questions. Inside his gym, the fighter felt the weight of all that attention pressing down on him. He scrolled through the comments online, thousands of them. Some angry, some mocking, some even cruel. The same people who had once praised him were now calling him arrogant, heartless, and out of control. It was a storm he couldn't punch his way out of. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unusual. Shame. It sat heavy in his chest, growing every time he thought about what he'd done. He remembered the cleaning lady's quiet voice, her eyes full of fear. He remembered how Van Damme had stepped in, not to fight, but to remind him what respect meant. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his dark apartment, the city lights flickering outside the window. His phone kept buzzing with notifications, sponsors pulling back, journalists asking for statements, fans tagging him in angry posts. He put the phone face down and ran his hands through his hair. For the first time, he began to ask himself a question he had avoided for years. When did I become this person? Meanwhile, Van Damme was back on the road, traveling for his next event. He wasn't paying much attention to the online noise. To him, what happened at the hotel wasn't about publicity. It was about doing what was right when no one else wanted to, He had spent his entire career learning that the hardest battles were not fought in the ring, but inside the heart. One afternoon, during an interview for a charity event, a reporter asked him about the hotel story. Van Damme smiled faintly and said, "I didn't do anything special. I just stepped in because someone needed help. The real story isn't about me. It's about how we treat people who can't fight back." The clip of that short interview went viral again. This time it wasn't the confrontation people were talking about. It was the message behind it. Thousands of comments poured in from around the world. People shared their own stories of standing up for others, of moments when kindness had changed a situation. What began as a small act of defense was now becoming a quiet movement online. Back in the fighter's city, things were getting harder. His coach called him to the gym one morning. When he arrived, he could tell something was different. The other fighters looked at him quietly, avoiding eye contact. His coach, an older man who had trained him since his early days, stood near the ring. "Sit down," he said. The fighter obeyed, unsure of what was coming. His coach looked at him seriously. "You've always been strong," he said. "But strength without humility is dangerous. I warned you before, the way you treat people outside the cage matters just as much as how you fight inside it." The fighter nodded silently. "Do you know what disappointed me the most?" The coach continued. "It's not that Van Damme stepped in. It's that he had to." Those words hit harder than any punch. The fighter looked down at the floor. He didn't argue. For once, he had nothing to say. After a long silence, the coach said, "You can fix this. Not with words, not with interviews, but with actions. Go find that woman. Tell her what you need to tell her, not for the cameras, for yourself." That advice stayed with him. He didn't want to make it public or dramatic. He just wanted to do it quietly the right way. So a few days later, he returned to the same hotel. The staff recognized him but looked uncomfortable. They knew why he was there. He asked to see the cleaning lady, and after a few minutes she came out from the service area, wearing the same gray uniform. When she saw him, she looked nervous again, unsure of what he wanted this time. He spoke softly. "I'm not here to bother you. I just wanted to say I'm truly sorry. For everything." She looked at him carefully, trying to see if he meant it. He did. His voice was calm and his eyes were tired but sincere. He went on, "I lost control that day. I said things I never should have said. You didn't deserve that. I've been thinking about it ever since." She nodded slowly. "It's okay," she said quietly. "It's in the past," he shook his head. "It shouldn't have happened. I want you to know I've learned from it." She gave a small smile. "Then it's not wasted," she said. "If you learn from something bad, it becomes something good." Her words surprised him. They were simple but powerful. He thanked her again and handed her a small envelope. Not money, but a handwritten letter. Inside, he had written an apology in his own words, explaining how he wanted to change. She accepted it politely. When he left the hotel, he felt something lift off his chest. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe normally again. He didn't know if the public would ever forgive him, but at least he had started forgiving himself. Around that time, Van Damme was giving a talk at a martial arts academy overseas. A young student asked him what it truly meant to be strong. Van Damme smiled and said, "Strength is not what you show in front of others. It's what you do when no one is watching. It's when you choose kindness over pride." The audience clapped softly. His words weren't dramatic, but they reached people in a way few could. Meanwhile, the fighter started training again, this time with a different mindset. He began volunteering at youth centers, teaching young athletes not just how to fight, but how to handle emotions. He told them, "You can't be a champion if you don't respect people." Some of them didn't believe the change was real at first, but over time they saw it. Months later, during a press conference for his comeback fight, a journalist asked him about the hotel incident. He didn't dodge the question. He said, "I made a mistake. A big one. And I learned that fame doesn't make you better than anyone. What matters is how you treat people. I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone clapped, followed by others. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about growth. People could see he meant what he said. The video of that press conference spread just like the first one had. But this time, the comments were different. People admired his honesty. Some even said, maybe Van Damme saved 2 people that day and not just the woman, but the fighter too. And in a way they were right, because sometimes life gives you moments that test who you really are. For the fighter, that moment came in a hotel hallway, when his anger met someone else's courage. For Van Damme, it was a chance to show that real heroes don't always fight. Sometimes they simply step forward when no one else will. As for the cleaning lady, her life didn't change in big, dramatic ways, but she carried something inside her, the memory that kindness still existed, even in a world where people often forgot it. She became stronger, more confident, and proud of the quiet role she had played in a story that touched millions. And that's how one simple act, one moment of courage, started a ripple that reminded the world of something timeless. Real strength is never about who's the toughest. It's about who has the heart to stand up for what's right. Weeks turned into months, but the story didn't fade away as quickly as most internet trends do. It continued to live quietly in people's minds. The video of Jean-Claude Van Damme stepping in at that hotel had become more than just a viral clip. It had become a symbol. Teachers showed it to students when talking about respect. Coaches mentioned it during training sessions. Even in workplaces, people used it as an example of standing up for others without violence or anger. For Van Damme, life went on as usual. He kept traveling, teaching, and training just like he always had. But everywhere he went, people wanted to thank him. At airports, strangers came up to shake his hand. At charity events, people told him how that one small act had inspired them to be braver in their own lives. He always smiled humbly and said the same thing. It's not about me. It's about doing what's right. He never took credit because he knew that if everyone waited for someone famous to make a difference, nothing would ever truly change. What mattered was the message, not the man who carried it. Meanwhile, the UFC fighter had started rebuilding his life piece by piece. His suspension was still in place and his sponsors were cautious, but he was slowly earning back people's respect through actions, not words. He didn't post flashy videos or long apologies online. Instead, he spent time in quiet places, youth gyms, community centers, and local schools, talking to kids about anger and self-control. He told them stories about his own mistakes, never pretending to be perfect. You don't win every fight, he said during one of his visits, but you can win yourself back if you try hard enough. The kids listened closely because they could see he meant it. There was something raw and real about his honesty. He started to train differently too. Before, he had trained to destroy opponents, to prove he was the toughest man in the ring. Now he trained with patience. He focused on breathing, on balance, on discipline, the things that had once been buried beneath his pride. His coach noticed the difference immediately. "You're not fighting angry anymore," he said one morning. The fighter smiled quietly and replied, "I'm not fighting anyone. I'm just learning." The media began to notice his change too. A journalist who had once criticized him harshly reached out for an interview. At first, he didn't want to do it, afraid it would turn into another headline circus. But his coach encouraged him. "Speak the truth," he said. "People can tell when it's real." So he agreed. The interview was simple. No lights, no makeup, no rehearsed answers. It was just him, sitting in a small gym talking honestly. He said, "I made mistakes that came from ego. I forgot that being strong doesn't mean being cruel. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But a man I grew up watching reminded me what real strength looks like. It's not in the fist, it's in the heart." That clip went viral too, but in a completely different way. People weren't angry anymore. They were inspired. They saw growth. They saw humility. The comments were filled with encouragement, forgiveness, and even admiration. Someone wrote, "It takes a real man to admit when he's wrong." Another said, "Van Damme didn't just stop a fight. He helped someone find himself again." Even Van Damme saw the interview. He was in another country at the time, getting ready for a small martial arts demonstration. When one of his team members showed him the video, he smiled. "Good," he said quietly. He learned. He didn't reach out or make a statement. He didn't need to. The change was already happening, and that was enough. One morning, the fighter decided to visit the hotel again, this time not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. He brought a small bouquet of flowers and asked the manager if the cleaning lady was working that day. She was. When she came to the lobby, she looked surprised to see him. He smiled warmly. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "You probably don't realize it, but you changed my life that day too." She looked confused. "Me?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, because of what happened, I learned to be better. I used to think strength was about power. Now I know it's about respect. You taught me that without saying a word. The woman didn't know what to say. She just smiled softly and said, maybe we both learned something that day. He handed her the flowers and left quietly, not wanting to make a scene. For him, that small act felt like closure, a full circle moment that brought peace where once there had been chaos. Later that year, he made his return to the UFC. The arena was packed, lights flashing, fans cheering louder than ever. But this time he walked in with a different energy. Gone was the angry man who wanted to prove something. In his place stood someone calm, focused, and grateful. He fought with control and grace, every move precise, every strike measured. It wasn't about destruction anymore, and it was about mastery. And when he won, he didn't scream or boast. He simply raised his hands, bowed slightly, and thanked his opponent for a good fight. The crowd noticed the difference. They saw not just a fighter, but a man who had grown. After the fight, in the post-match interview, the reporter asked him what had changed. He paused for a moment and said, "Once upon a time, I met someone who reminded me that kindness doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The audience applauded. Some even stood up. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about redemption. Meanwhile, Van Damme was watching from his hotel room in another part of the world. When he saw the victory, he smiled proudly, not as a fan but as someone who had witnessed transformation. He turned off the TV and looked out the window, the city lights twinkling below. He didn't need credit or attention. Knowing that someone had found their better self because of one small act, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the story began to appear in documentaries and podcasts. People called it the hotel incident that changed two lives. It became more than a headline, and it became a lesson. Schools, gyms, and workplaces shared it as a reminder of empathy and accountability. The cleaning lady, still working quietly at the same hotel, sometimes smiled when guests mentioned it. She never tried to claim attention or fame. She stayed humble, knowing her role in the story wasn't about glory and it was about being herself. And that, she thought, was enough. One afternoon, the hotel manager called her to the office. He handed her an envelope and said it had come from overseas. Inside was a handwritten note and a photograph. The note was from Van Damme. It read, "Dear friend, I wanted to thank you for reminding the world what true courage looks like. You stood tall without raising your voice. You showed grace under pressure. That's something the world needs more of. Keep shining." She held the letter carefully, her eyes watering as she looked at the photo. It was of Van Damme standing in a dojo surrounded by students, smiling at the camera. She placed the letter in her locker, where she kept a few personal things that mattered most to her. Life didn't turn into a movie for her. She didn't suddenly become rich or famous, but every morning when she walked into work, she felt a quiet pride in her heart, a reminder that what happened wasn't for nothing. She had been part of something that made people think, that reminded the world of simple decency. The fighter, too, kept his promise to live differently. He became one of the few athletes known for mentoring young fighters about mental strength and humility. He often told them, "Don't let your fists speak louder than your heart." And every time he said it, he thought about that hallway, that moment, and the man who stood between him and a terrible mistake. Van Damme continued to live as he always had, training, traveling, and teaching, never trying to be a hero, only a human. But those who knew his story understood that sometimes being human is the most heroic thing of all, and so, what began as an ugly confrontation in a hotel hallway became a lasting reminder that no matter how strong, famous, or successful someone becomes, true greatness will always come from kindness, humility, and the courage to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Life settled into a quiet rhythm after the incident at the hotel, but the echoes of that day continued to shape everyone involved. For the cleaning lady, each morning began the same way. She would push her cart down the hallways, cleaning rooms, wiping tables, and tidying spaces that other people barely noticed. But something inside her had changed. She no longer felt invisible. Every time she passed a guest who gave her a polite nod or a smile, she felt a small spark of pride. She didn't talk much about the incident, and she never sought attention. Fame and recognition were foreign concepts to her, but she began noticing subtle differences in the way people treated her. Colleagues stopped dismissing her, and even guests who had once ignored her presence now acknowledged her politely. She could feel the respect growing around her, not because she demanded it, but because she carried herself with quiet confidence. At home, she shared small details of her life with her family, but she never bragged about what happened. She didn't need to. Her heart carried the memory of someone stepping in when she needed help, and that memory alone gave her strength. At night, she would sometimes think back to that hallway, the moment of tension and how calmly Van Damme had handled it. She realized that courage wasn't about fighting back with fists or shouting. It was about staying calm, standing up for what was right and knowing when to act. The UFC fighter, on the other hand, had undergone a transformation that went far deeper than anyone had expected. His suspension ended, but he did not rush back to the cage immediately. Instead, he spent months reflecting on his actions, his words, and his behavior. He worked with a counselor to confront his anger, his ego, and the parts of himself that had caused harm to others. He wanted to be better, not for anyone else, but for himself. He returned to training with a renewed sense of purpose. His sessions were longer, slower, and more focused. He didn't just train his body, he trained his mind. He learned to control his reactions, to breathe before responding, to pause and think before letting frustration take over. Coaches and teammates noticed the change immediately. He was calmer, more patient, and more respectful. He was no longer trying to prove his strength through aggression. He was trying to master it. He also began volunteering at local community centers and youth gyms. Young athletes came to learn from him, not just because of his reputation as a fighter, but because of the honesty he shared. He told them stories of mistakes he had made, of anger he had let control him, and of the lessons he had learned from that one hallway in the hotel. His honesty was magnetic. Kids listened closely because they saw a real person, someone who had failed but chose to learn and grow. Every time he spoke about the incident, he emphasized respect and empathy. "You can be strong, but if you can't be kind, your strength is worthless," he would tell them. And he meant it. Meanwhile, Van Damme continued his quiet life, traveling to seminars, charity events, and film sets. But the hotel incident, though small in his eyes, had left an impact far beyond the immediate moment. People everywhere were inspired by his calm courage. In small towns, classrooms, and gyms, videos of that hallway encounter were being used as lessons about standing up for others, about integrity, and about strength without cruelty. Van Damme never sought recognition for it. He did not post updates or ask for attention. For him, the lesson mattered more than fame. What mattered was showing that one person's choice to act with humanity could ripple outward, affecting lives in ways no one could predict. Months later, the three lives, the cleaning lady, the UFC fighter, and Van Damme, intersected again, though quietly. The hotel decided to host a small ceremony to honor employees who had shown extraordinary dedication. The cleaning lady was being recognized for her years of service. When she walked up to accept her certificate, she saw familiar faces in the crowd, the manager, colleagues, and even a few regular guests who had grown fond of her over the years. To her surprise, the UFC fighter was there as well, quietly standing to the side. He had come to support her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. When she noticed him, her eyes widened slightly, but she smiled politely. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement and a soft smile, one that carried both apology and respect. After the ceremony, he approached her. "I wanted to say it again," he said softly. "Thank you for teaching me something I will never forget." She shook her head, trying to refuse the credit, but he insisted. "No," he said gently. "That day in that hallway, you reminded me what real courage looks like. I'll carry that lesson forever." She smiled softly, her heart warm. "Then we both learned something," she said quietly. Van Damme, who had been standing quietly in the background, watched the exchange with a faint, approving smile. He didn't need to say anything. The moment itself was enough. The lesson had come full circle. In the weeks that followed, the story continued to be shared online, in magazines, and on social media. But this time it wasn't about anger, confrontation, or controversy. It was about redemption, humility, and the power of quiet courage. People were no longer talking about a fighter losing control or Van Damme stepping in. They were talking about the lessons learned, the lives changed, and the simple human acts that could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. The UFC fighter's career slowly returned to the spotlight, but he was different now. His fans noticed it immediately. He celebrated victories with grace, accepted defeats with humility, and treated every opponent with respect. Interviews focused not only on his skill in the cage, but also on his character outside it. He became a role model, not just for aspiring fighters, but for anyone learning the value of growth and accountability. The cleaning lady continued her quiet work, but her confidence had grown. She was no longer just someone who followed orders or did a job unseen. She had become a symbol of quiet strength. Even small gestures like a kind word to a guest or a gentle smile to a colleague carried more weight now because she knew her actions mattered. Van Damme returned to his life with the same humility he had always shown. He kept training, teaching, and traveling, but he also watched quietly from afar as the ripples of that day continued to spread. He knew that true strength wasn't measured in fame or skill alone. It was measured by how we impact others when no one is watching. One evening, the three of them, though not formally together, were each reminded of the day in different ways. The cleaning lady, while cleaning a quiet hallway, thought about the calm authority of the man who had stepped in for her. She felt the lesson of courage that didn't require shouting. The fighter, alone in a training room, remembered the fear in the woman's eyes and the calm presence of Van Damme. He breathed slowly, thinking about the patience and respect he now tried to carry with him every day. And Van Damme, looking out over a quiet city from his hotel window, thought about how one small act, a single choice to stand for what was right, had transformed lives in ways no one could have planned. He smiled quietly, knowing the lesson had been passed on, and the impact would continue far beyond any one day, one fight, or one hallway. The story, though simple, was profound. It wasn't about violence, celebrity, or punishment. It was about human decency, accountability, and the courage to do the right thing. Each person involved had grown in their own way, learning lessons they would carry for the rest of their lives. And sometimes life doesn't need grand gestures to change the world. Sometimes it only needs a calm heart, a brave step, and the quiet courage to act when others do not. Years later, the cleaning lady would still think of that day, smiling softly to herself. The fighter would continue teaching young athletes about respect, patience, and humility. Van Damme would keep traveling, training, and inspiring quietly as he had always done. And somewhere in the memories of everyone who knew the story, the hallway in that hotel remained a symbol, a reminder that true strength, real courage, and lasting impact often come from the simplest, most human choices. It was a story without headlines, without trophies, and without dramatic confrontations that mattered in the end. It was a story about people, about the power of humility, about the difference one small act can make in the lives of many. And that, more than anything else, was the lesson everyone carried away. In the quiet of a hotel hallway, in a small gesture of kindness, and in the calm presence of someone willing to step in when it mattered, the world had been reminded of something timeless, that real courage isn't loud, it isn't aggressive, and it doesn't seek attention. Real courage is human, and it changes lives, quietly, profoundly, and forever.